Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're zooming in from. It's great to see you all at our webinar. We host these weekly at the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford, and we do so in cooperation with the Hewlett Foundation. My name is Marietje Schaake. I'm the Cyber Policy Center's International Policy Director. And this week, I'm very happy that you're joining us because we're zooming in on a topic that is both technically complex, so it's helpful to unpack it a little bit, and a topic that is surrounded by high stakes policy discussions really worldwide. And it's the production and distribution of semiconductors or microchips. Microchips or semiconductors are key components of all smart devices. So think about cars that need, I think, thousands of them per car, but also phones and many other connected devices. So essentially everybody needs them, but the crux is not everybody can produce them. So this causes supply chain issues, concerns around the reliability of the supplies for the production process, the security and the trust that can be put into them. And that has a lot to do with the relationship with both sourcing countries and importing countries. Now, there's a lot of competition between companies, obviously, national champions that are also seeking more and more investments as this industry is rising to the top of critical industries. And besides the quest for state investments or support from governments through policies, there's the normal innovative race for improving the microchips and the market share, which is cutthroat as well. These are companies that are resource intensive. So even if we were to decide today that we were going to invest in shoring up our domestic industries, it would take years to reach that point of having the factories and the talent and the innovation in place if we were to succeed at all. So it is not an industry that can be influenced through policy in an instance. And to take an example, both the US and China rely on imports for their industries. So it's a global industry that has customers all over the world. Now, the EU and the US have taken initiatives to shore up their production, to boost their industries, to be less dependent on imports from elsewhere in the world. Both transatlantic partners have adopted CHIPS Acts that promise to invest billions of euros and dollars in strengthening domestic players. Now, what I hope is that both the US and the EU can work together and sort of integrate those efforts as part of their wider democratic governance-driven agenda and the Trade and Technology Council, for example. Warm words have been spoken about each other's initiatives, so that's a good start. But we'll have to see how they end up unfolding. Now, for today's session, I'm very grateful to introduce four excellent speakers to you. They are going to share their brief introductory remarks of about 5 minutes each to set the scene and speak from their respective points of view. And the people attending, so you, the audience, can feel free to share your questions through our Q&A function, and I'll try to address as many as possible to the panel. Just to remind everybody, the session is recorded for later reviewing and sharing. So it's on the record, but there is an option of asking questions anonymously. So now a brief introduction of our panelists today. Eva Majdel is a friend and a former colleague in the European Parliament. She is from Bulgaria and serves with the GERB party. Her focus since she started as a member of European Parliament has always been on tech, AI, innovation, and industry. She holds a bachelor's degree in international affairs and business administration, and also has done leadership courses at Harvard's Kennedy School. Then we have Sarah Stewart, who is the executive director of Silverado Policy Accelerator, which is a relatively new initiative, a little bit more than 1 year old, and founded by Dmitry Alperovich. It seeks to forge a path toward American prosperity and global competitiveness by accelerating bipartisan, and this is important in America today, bipartisan economic, strategic, and technological policy solutions. She has experience in working in the tech sector, the US Trade Representative's Office. So brings a whole host of experience to Silverado and to our panel today. Then we welcome Annette Aris, who is a senior affiliate professor of strategy at INSEAD in Fontainebleau in France, from which she's joining us today, where she focuses on digital transformation and disruption and its impact on society, industries, and companies. Annette brings a mountain of experience to this panel. She's a non-executive board member on a variety of publicly listed companies all over Europe. Just to name a few, she serves on the board of Rabobank, Randstad, which is a HR services company, and the microchip machine manufacturer ASML. The intralogistics and forklift truck manufacturer Jungheinrich, and the insurance company ESR in the Netherlands. And in doing all her work, she has been ranked in the top 10 of most influential corporate directors in the Netherlands. Then last but not least, joining us is Pierre-Arnaud Proulx. He is a member of cabinet of the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Margrethe Vestager, where he focuses on industrial policy, the internal market, space policy, and so on. And he holds degrees from HEC in Paris in science management, has a Master of International Management and a Master of History. So all in all, a wealth of experience and perspectives. Thank you for joining us. I would like to ask Eva to start with her introduction. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Margrethe and Stanford University for holding this discussion today and for having me invited alongside experts on the topic. Well, perhaps I would just give a few remarks on where I see the role of the European Parliament and what the European Union is seeking with the CHIPS Act that we have put forward. I think the most important thing we seek through the CHIPS Act is trying to put the European Union back in this global race. Because clearly other actors are not standing still. Of course, our US friends have the same aims and goals. And as you said, just like you, I very much welcome that ambition and I hope we'll be working together. But we also have China on the other side, Taiwan, and many others. And I think, our goal and aim is to double our production rate, but that's the same goal that everyone else has. So I very much see this as a tech race. And this is why from the perspective here of the European Parliament, perhaps I'll give 4 points which could help us increase the supply and the production of semiconductors. The first one is related to unlocking finance and finding ways to use the investment we propose in the European CHIPS Act to unlock venture capital funding into our chips industry. The amount of resources Europe puts on the table is not as high as the US or other nations, but currently the sums that are required are really humongous for our economies. And despite some of so to say, generous contributions of some governments, they will not be enough. So our aim is to unlock that other finance that is out there. The second point, particularly for Europe, but not only, because I think this is one of the reasons, among others, why China has not been able to excel in the chip productions, is talent and skills. We know that talent attracts talent. We know that people are the ones that drive an industry. And without those professionals that we need for that particular industry, none of the goals we have set ourselves for will be able to be realized. So this would mean that we need to recruit people from the semiconductor industry already at an educational stage. We need to be able to explain them the industry, and most importantly, the importance and the impact the industry has on society, but also its meaning and its purpose. And that goes to the fact of Europe finally realizing, and this is partially due to COVID and more importantly due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we realizing our strategic vulnerabilities. And chips is a huge strategic vulnerability for the free world. 90%, we all know in that discussion of the chips that are most advanced come from Taiwan, a country that is constantly under attack from China. So this is why showing to young professionals the importance of the industry could be one way of attracting talent. The third point, and you emphasized quite a bit on it in your opening remarks, and it's something that I plan to work and intend with our international partners, is related to cooperation with our democratic and international allies. We need more of that cooperation. And of course, the Trade and Technology Council should not be a wasted opportunity. It's a good forum and a forum of change and decision-making, and it has to deliver tangible results. So this is why I think it was encouraging to see Executive Vice President Vestager and Secretary Raimondo to have moved the semiconductor topic up in the priority list, if I may say so. So in a couple of days, there will be a meeting in Paris between the EU and the US, and hopefully we are going to hear a little bit more in that topic. Certainly some of us in this discussion have been working in that direction for quite some time now. And I myself will be traveling to the US on that topic as well next week. And the last point that I want to bring up is speed to act and respond. I mean, what the European Act on Chips has to do is to facilitate the ease of production for those that are able and decide to identify Europe as the place to invest. We need to do that by logistical support, so to say, whether it's speeding up licensing, increasing the visa pathways for skilled workers, of course, reducing bureaucracy. And also one of the plans we have is to, which I think is very important, is to have a semiconductor board that very effectively identifies those supply chain weaknesses, that can improve decision-making, and most importantly, hopefully can improve the speed with which we take decisions. And lastly, I think, perhaps what we see is that there's a lot of complexity in supply chain that are involved in chip production. And this is, for me, something that I mentioned, that's why China hasn't been able to excel and build its own chip industry. But this is why we also need to look towards Taiwan as a model to reinvigorate our own supply chain models, for example. And we need to have a lesser focus on what can be achieved in the next few years, because we don't even have a decade on our hands, maximum 5 to 7 years at the best. So the clock is ticking, and I think discussions such as today lay a good basis for policymakers to act faster, but also for the business community to understand how we can cooperate together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eva. That was a great start, laying out the different and urgent aspects of how to push the needle to the place where it needs to be, and all the strategic angles that are at play here that complicate the results a little bit too. Sarah, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks for having me. And I think a lot of my remarks will echo what you've just heard, which I think is a good thing, because it means that there's convergence across the Atlantic. So at Silverado, we've been looking at this issue from a couple of different perspectives. And so I want to sort of pick that apart a little bit today. The first is from the domestic perspective and looking at, recently, of course, we've been in a global supply crunch. And so that is driving, a number of different, alarm bells to go off. And so what does that mean? How do we deal with this? And how do we not just deal with this current crisis, but how do we think about a more durable, resilient supply chain, for the longer term? So one of the reasons that we're in this predicament, where we have very little control over the supply, is that we're not making as many chips here in the US anymore. And so this has driven the US to push forward with a couple of pieces of legislation. Right now, the US Congress is in conference over CHIPS Act funding. There's already been legislation authorizing the US to create a program for applicants to receive government incentives to bring production capacity back to the US. That program is now under consideration for funding. There's other legislation that would provide tax credits to another sort of subset of the sector. These are all super important measures, and we're hoping that these move forward and give us the boost that we need. In talking with some folks, they've said that part of the reason that they have moved, offshore is that the cost differential of operating in the US versus, in Asia can be up to 30%. So that's not insignificant. And I think part of what's trying to be achieved with this legislation is to close that gap. I would say, however, that I think that we need to be really strategic about how we implement this legislation and this funding, hopefully when it goes through, because there's not an unlimited amount of funding. And because the supply chain is so complex, there is no viable way to bring all of the production capacity back to the United States. And of course, this gets to the issue of working with allies. But it also gets to the issue of, so then how do we choose? How do we decide, which projects that we should greenlight with this taxpayer funding versus which projects maybe we can, source from our partners, and which projects, maybe we don't care where the source comes from. So one of the things that I think that we need to do is we really need a data-driven assessment that looks across domestically and internationally what the production capacity is today across all the different chip types and the node sizes and where we're going, and use that to help inform how we disperse any funding here in the US and how we work with partners. I also think that one of the things that we need to be thinking about domestically is what should the eligibility for US taxpayer dollar funding be? Should companies need to do really good things in the communities where they're going to set up, which is contemplated, in the legislation? Should you be, investing in R&D, investing in talent where you are working with local communities? What about energy efficiency, focusing in on that? And then on the flip side of that coin is, what shouldn't applicants be doing? Should they be able to be operating in adversary nations and accepting subsidies from those countries while at the same time, getting an incentive in the US? I think these are some of the kinds of questions that, we need to be thinking about. The final thing that I'll say domestically is that, in talking with a lot of different companies that are very concerned about, making sure that they have a resilient supply chain, the production side of this is one piece of this. So we can double down on, increasing production capacity in the US and with partners. But if we are not also incentivizing other parts of that ecosystem to come closer, we are really only, going so far, because then, you might produce the chip here, but then it's still going to Asia in order to do testing and assembly and other things. So that's another piece of this that I think that we need to really be looking at. The second prong is that we have to be working with allies. I totally agree on that. The US has a lot of bilateral and regional efforts that are going on right now in this space. And I welcome that and applaud that. I wonder, and I put this out for, any comment from our panelists or for people to be thinking about, do we need an overarching body that can help to coordinate all of these different work initiatives, so that, if we have the US and the EU working towards something, and the US and Japan working towards something, and the Quad working on something, is there a need to bring a group of like-minded countries together to sit down and say, first things first, let's do a global mapping. Let's figure out how we can coordinate here. Let's think about, how we can work together on R&D, on standards, on export controls, on trade facilitation, on removing trade barriers, on protecting intellectual property. In my mind, I think that there's definitely a need for the bilateral and regional initiatives to continue, but I think you could have even wider ranging impact if you put it all together. And the last thing I will say is that we do have to, when we look out over the longer term, there are geopolitical risks here that we need to really be thinking about. Taiwan right now is home to the biggest manufacturer of logic chips in the world, and they are doing a lot of manufacturing at certain nodes that can't be produced anywhere else. We're catching up in the US. We're putting a lot of, research and money, into making sure that we're competitive over the long term. But Taiwan is sitting there right now with an aggressive China, right, that wants to reunify Taiwan with mainland China. There's, a lot that we need to be thinking about there in terms of what that means if China takes the next step, and what that means for global supply chains. So I think that, one of the things where the US and allies could work together is figuring out how to deal with adversary nations, even if they aren't, at that same level of technological competitiveness yet. Are there things that they're going to do to get there through, forced technology transfer and acquisition of trade secrets? So I think that those are some areas that we really need to keep our eye on over the longer term. So I'll stop there and look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks, Sarah. Very helpful and really broadening and deepening everything that is at stake and at play here. I think we have a lot to unpack. So over to Annette.
Yeah, I would like to use the 5 minutes I have to cover a few key trends in the semiconductor industry, the consequences of these trends for the industry, and the actions we can take. When I talk about trends, I see 3 key trends. First of all, the unexpected shortage in microchips, which is likely to last in the coming years. And there are 2 main reasons for it. First of all, the unexpected demand surge, partly caused by COVID, because there were some industries which pushed the brake too strongly at the beginning of COVID, like the car industry. And on the other hand, an unexpected growth in what we thought were mature segments like PCs and mobile phones, which suddenly were used a lot more in COVID times. But on the other side, independent of COVID, we also saw a big growth because we got to the adoption tipping point of certain technologies like Internet of Things, like cloud, like blockchain, which suddenly started taking off. We talked about it a long time, and now it's really happening. And all these things need a lot of chips, and not the sophisticated chips, but relatively simple chips. So to our big surprise, we saw that many chips where we thought it would be a mature market were suddenly growing markets. Not only on the demand side, but also on the supply side, there were causes for the shortage. First of all, there were the operational impediments from COVID, factories which closed, customer service which had to be done remotely, transportation delays, but also many of the semiconductor players in the industry pushed the brakes and invested less than they had planned beforehand due to COVID. So the results of this increasing demand and decreasing supply is an unexpected shortage, and especially in what we would call the workhorses in the microchip production. At ASML, we have the sophisticated EUV machines and the sturdy DUV machines, and you see that above all, the DUV machines are suddenly short in supply. In 2019, we still thought that the market would decline, and now it's growing fast. The second trend, which is very important, is what I would call the very thin supply chain. So what has been happening? Because the technological advancements have been so big, there have been only very, very few companies who've been able to keep up with it. And it's in all parts of the chain, whether you talk about the lenses which are needed for the lithography machines, if you talk about the lithography machines themselves, if you talk about the metrology in the production process, those processes all have become so sophisticated that there are only very few companies in the world who can do that. At the same time, there has been an increased pressure on cost, if we think about Moore's law, and therefore the increased importance of skill. So this combination of the technological challenges and the skill led to a concentration in many, many parts of the value chain. So in many parts of the semiconductor value chain, there are only single suppliers or only a few, and these suppliers are all around the globe. And that means that there has been an enormous increase in mutual dependency between all the players in the value chain because there were no alternatives. The third trend, and I will not dwell on that because Eva and Sarah already talked a lot about it, is then, of course, the geopolitical tension, now also aggravated by the Russia crisis. So what are the consequences of these trends, of the shortage, of the thin supply chains, and of the geopolitical tension? Well, one big consequence is what I would say a big increase in the key man risk. So we depend very much on a few key players with unique skills throughout the chain, be it Zeiss, the lenses in Germany, be it Trumpf for the lasers, be it ASML, and also be it TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in Korea. The second consequence is that the industry has become much more susceptible to disturbances, because the utilization of all the factories and all the systems has become so high. And we all know the law that once machines are more than 80% utilized, if there's a small disturbance, the delays become exponential and throughput times increase enormously. It's like you have dominoes which fall after another once you get one little disturbance. And thirdly, we have an increased risk for what I would call discretionary political decisions, which when not taken in a careful and considered way, might completely disrupt the value chain. So overall, the semiconductor industry has become a lot more fragile in the last year. And this is a major global risk given the dependence we have on the chips. So finally, what can we do about it? Well, first of all, I think we should focus on becoming, as Nassim Taleb said, anti-fragile. So it means we will have to invest more in buffers and redundancy. We will have to have a thicker supply chain. Interestingly enough, I think regionalization, so China versus Europe and US, is not going to help, because then you will have two thin supply chains instead of one thick supply chain. So somehow we have to find a way where we still keep a global approach. This will cost time and this will cost money, and it will slow down Moore's law. We should not only look though at the supply side, we might also look at the demand side. And maybe we should think about reducing the chipification of everything. Everything is becoming chips and we become more and more dependent on it. So maybe we should talk to tech giants, to manufacturers of cars, to maybe slow down a bit the chipification and rely maybe a bit on mechanical and other things. All this will approach, like Sarah said, will need a holistic approach. We will have to work together between industries, governments, international bodies to think this through and have a holistic approach where the main aim should be to reduce the vulnerability of the chain. This will require a good mix of innovations by company, of regulations, of subsidies, and above all, and I fully agree there with Sarah and Eva, a need to act very fast before the system completely destabilizes. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's super helpful to really look at the details of what is at stake here in these supply chains, and which companies offer which specialized components, and to really see a tension between the mutual dependence and the competition. I think that's a theme that we may want to unpack a little bit further, because it's an interesting tension there. But before we come to a more interactive part, let me turn to Pierre Arnaud. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting this event, and there were already 3 very interesting presentations, so I will try not to repeat too much. But I would like to present a bit the proposal made by the Commission for Chips Act. And before that, I think we need to start with the context in which this proposal has been drafted and then proposed to the Parliament and the Council. So first, I think that there were 2 important lessons from the COVID crisis. And the first one is simply, and you said it also in your introduction, that chips are extremely important. And until now, maybe they did not gather the attention, the political attention that they deserve, because you need chips for basically any industry. And it will be more and more the case. So Internet of Things has already been mentioned, but that's a global trend. But also more traditional industry, we could see they fully rely on chips. And it was the case, for example, of the automotive sector, which is extremely important for the European economy. So we need chips, and we will need them more and more. And the second thing, which has already been described as well, but if I can explain a bit more, is simply that the value chains are becoming more and more relying on a very limited number of actors. Because of technology, as it has been mentioned, and also because of financial capacity, because all these chips production facilities are more and more costly every generation. And now only a very limited number of companies can afford the machine and can afford the production facilities. And of course, some of these very important actors, they are located in areas or geographic in which there are some important geopolitical tension, and it has already been mentioned. So that's how the Commission came up with the proposal early February. And of course, with the invasion of Ukraine end of February, some of these questions became even more prominent, and the question of security of supply. So what do we want to achieve? I would say there are 2 objectives. Of course, the main one for the Commission is to secure the supply chain, to avoid the repetition on the mid to long term of this event, because we cannot really tackle the supply chain disruption. The second thing as well, which is a bit a secondary objective, is that we want to help also companies to better use chips, because they will become more and more relevant. So we need also European industry to be able to design and to use its own chips. And that's how we came up with this proposal of Chips Act with 3 different pillars. So the first one is the Chips for Europe initiative. And here it's very much focused on research. So what we want to do is to continue to innovate, because in the EU, in Europe, we've got leading research organization and leading companies in terms of research. And we want to help this leading organization to bring their innovation to the market. And what we want to develop in particular are pilot lines, but also some design capacities, because in Europe we don't have so much design capacities in chips. And it's sometimes complicated for smaller companies in particular to adopt new technologies. The second pillar is called security of supply. So here we want to accelerate the development of production facilities in the EU. And here I have to say that a lot is not so much in the regulation, because we already have a framework existing in the EU. So we simply try to explain in our communication how our control of subsidies, or our control of state aid, as we call it in the EU, would apply to these new chips production facilities. And here there are many questions that we ask ourselves, which are similar to what Sarah Stewart also mentioned. What can we ask also to this company to do to be sure that the aid that we give to them is proportionate and appropriate, that we don't give too much and receive nothing in return? So we also think that there should be some positive spillover for the economy in terms of, for example, of training of people. So to also link up with the point of Eva Meidel on the importance of skills. The third pillar also is development of a toolbox in the EU to be prepared in case of future shortage. And here we introduced, in fact, a mechanism which already exists in the US, but in which for part of it has also been used during the crisis, and it has been a bit the model. For example, it's simply information gathering, but it can be also to prioritize some orders. Because in the crisis, in the EU, we had very limited information on the real situation of supply chain, because simply we could not ask companies, even European companies like the US could do. So that's our proposal, but also I wanted to say, and it has already been said by many, that the international dimension of the European Chips Act is extremely important. And here I also agree with that has been said before, that we cannot do everything alone. And that has never been the objective of the EU. It's just too costly, and we don't have also necessarily the technological capacity. So we want to continue working with partners and also with non-partners. So we will remain in a world of mutual dependencies and not in a world where the EU will be fully independent. And for that, the US has indeed a very specific role, and the EU-US transatlantic relation at the moment is working very well. So we had already meeting in Pittsburgh last year, the launch of the TTC, and indeed the Semiconductor Working Group is an important topic in this TTC, and we are working together to build concrete cooperation, and we are also very much looking forward to the meeting which will take place in 2 weeks in Paris to continue working and bringing more let's say concrete solution and concrete common solution with the US. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Piero. No, I think it's important that you say the transatlantic relation is good for the moment, because that could also become a whole new geopolitical dynamic of its own, which I think no one on this panel hopes for, but which is a reality that we may have to consider as well. So in the meantime, 3 questions have come in, and I also have a question, and we don't have all that much time. So what I thought I would do is just throw a bunch of questions at the panel, come back in the same order that we started, so that everybody knows when I'm going to turn to you, and just feel free to either pick out one. You don't have to address all. If you really want to, you can, but just make sure that we address the questions to the person who feels most, called to speak to them. I think they're all very good questions that will help deepen this discussion. But what I take away, and I think is actually really a broader challenge, is how many lessons learned there are here, really about sort of the underestimating of the strategic nature of microchips, and especially for the EU and the US that have doubled down in terms of policy. We see a broader trend, I think, where the fragility of supply chains had not been appreciated, where the impact of geopolitical risk and change had not been appreciated, and where perhaps a low price was paid somewhere, but there was high cost, if you really put it all together. So any reflections on the lessons learned and how it fits in a broader discussion about that mutual dependence, which, many would argue trade and interdependence globally has also prevented conflict, because there would be pain felt on all sides of the equation. And on the other hand, a real sense of competition, and some would argue even protectionism, extraordinary circumstances under which state aid is being proposed to be injected into these industries in a way that we haven't seen in a long time, a real call for building national champions, where there's also criticism on China, for example, for investing so heavily from the state and having such a heavy hand from the top down in the economy. So I think, on the one hand, important lessons learned. On the other hand, a delicate balance to strike is not easy. I don't envy anyone who has to navigate these two sort of poles in the debate. Now, coming to the questions, the first one was indeed asked anonymously, and I quote, I'm in manufacturing and semiconductors located in the US. I observe high turnover and a labor shortage in manufacturing. What has been the global experience of the various panelists in other countries with regards to labor and staffing? That was question 1. Question 2 comes from John Waller, who asks, quote, if the EU and the US cooperate in increasing their production of semiconductors rather than compete, what impact will that have on innovation towards developing new chips? And last but not least, Bruce Crawford asks, quote, modern semiconductor manufacturing uses large amounts of ultra-pure water. US-based manufacturing seems to be moving to the Western US in areas where water is already scarce. Could someone address this disconnect? Have there been new innovations in water management plans? So thank you all for the questions. I see that some new ones have come in, but I would suggest that we start with these questions and over to Eva to pick which one she likes to address.
Thank you very much. I would probably just briefly touch upon the geopolitical implications briefly, and maybe a little bit on the skills question. So first of all, clearly we've all pointed out of the huge national security implications the semiconductor race poses to our democratic nations. What we see is that China is really doing everything it can to increase supply and production of chip, to increase its range of application, and that includes within the military sphere. The way I see it, and you might think it's a little bit of an exaggerated way of seeing the importance of chips, is that whoever creates the most advanced chips in the world and whoever gets there first, we will also have the greatest military advantage in the 21st and 22nd century. And we have to be really prepared for this instant shift in supply that we were talking about, and that's why it's so important to learn our lessons. Whether that's a war that reduces supply of critical materials from autocratic states like Russia when it comes to palladium, whether there is aggression from China towards Taiwan, which can bring the global supply chain crashing or to a halt to some extent, or there's some sort of a trade war that blocks shipping for a month. I think we need to learn the lessons that we also see just from a few days ago. Europe's dependence on Russian energy has made its supply chain vulnerable. So within Europe, at least, I think we've been naive for a very long time, and there's no time for naivety anymore. And this is why, and here perhaps I will bring Sarah's point and question, do we need this overarching body? Well, if you ask me, I'll be first out there to say yes, but I have been popping that question to a number of colleagues around, and they're not so clear on whether that's the way forward. People still think, well, we need to be the best and we need to be first and we need to perform better compared to the US. Well, I don't see US as a rivalry. I see it as a nation with which we can only cooperate. And again, we should stop to be naive. It's now 2 weeks in the war in Ukraine, and this should be our kind of a last, shake to wake us up and to say, well, let's approach our democratic allies and work with them, and not try to see whether we are going to produce more chips or the US will be producing more chips. So it will be really important to build on those just bilateral or regional forums and have some sort of a more global approach, but one would need to find, the decision makers that are ready to see the true big picture in that and go beyond their national or continental borders. And I think this would be very helpful in preparing for all sorts of supply chain issues that we might be facing in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Just a couple of points. One is, the allies get together all the time, right, to cooperate and to, let's take trade, for example. Anytime that the US goes into a trade agreement with another country, there's trade-offs there. There is tariff liberalization, which means that both sides are, going to get more of each other's product, which, is going to have some people are going to win, some people are going to lose. But on balance, the point is to try and create a deeper relationship with your ally and to put yourself in a more competitive position with your ally than your adversary. And so I think in this situation, there is a way to cooperate and compete. I don't think that it has to be a one or the other choice. I think that the US and the EU and many others can work together here to, find efficiencies, to leverage each other's strengths, and you do it to the extent possible. You're not going to do it if it, cuts you off at the knees and doesn't allow you to be competitive. But I think the idea going in should be that you can both compete and cooperate. And then one other piece, which is on the question of in the water. I've asked this question myself. I'm like, I don't understand why we're not seeing more fab action on the coasts. And the answers that I have gotten, and maybe Annette has more information on this, is the construction is going where states are offering the incentives to help with competitiveness. And they're also going where there is less, sort of regulatory burden when it comes to some of the permitting and other things. And so one thing that I wanted to raise on the environmental permitting that we've been looking into is, how we can find a way to expedite the projects, but without sacrificing the environmental standards that we have, held dearly. And I think that one possible path here is you set up a dedicated office within the US Environmental Protection Agency that is focused entirely on semiconductor projects. And then you have the expertise going into that permitting process that allows it to move forward faster, but without sort of turning a blind eye to some of these other pieces.
Great, thank you. Annette.
Sorry, let me unmute first. I was very much triggered by your question around lessons learned and mutual dependency. Just taking a step back, what I think, if you look at the semiconductor industry, and it's a bit like the tech industry, you see by the nature of the industry that it automatically pivots to a certain industry structure. In this case, the thin supply chain, like you had with the tech giants, it automatically goes to this big monster monopoly-like structures. And that is an underlying dynamic. And I don't think we really politicians understood that dynamic good enough. And therefore they were much too late in acting on it. And if you act in the wrong way and you don't kind of focus on the dynamic, but just on the symptoms, and you start building factories or other things, you don't solve anything. So I think you really have to look at the root cause of why do industry structures develop in that way. And at the same time, combining it with the question of innovation, the interesting thing about this industry is, although you have a lot of single players in part of the value chain, it's still one of the most innovative industries, although there is not that much competition around. So the question is, why does that happen? And how can you keep that up? And my big scare is that we now start doing all kinds of measures, which are symptom measures. We build a factory here, we do a bit there, and we have international cooperation, and it slows everything down. And so the question is, how can we really understand where to interfere and where not to interfere? And my scare is that we're going to spend a lot of subsidy money and fighting symptoms and then not solving the root causes. And so I think what you say, Sarah, really understanding, getting the data, understanding why the dynamics are, is going to be very, very important before we start throwing around a lot of money.
Good point. I hope there's still time for that, because the appetite to spend money is certainly there. Pierre-Arnaud, what do you think about this tension?
I think there is appetite to spend money, but I'm not sure to be able to reply to what was the root cause. But I think it's, or I would reply to it in another way. It's maybe also because a lot of money has already been given to the industry that it also develops this way. So we are also trying to balance what the cause is by proposing this CHIPS Act, and by also putting new subsidies also in all systems in the EU or in the US, I think. So it's also a measure to go back a bit more to normality. And I think the objective of securing supply chain is precisely to diversifying. So I hope that we don't address only the symptoms, but that we can also bring solutions. Because if we have production a bit here, a bit there, even if we are talking about the same actors, basically, because we will not create new national or European actors or new champions, I heard that as well. But we will just give ways to companies to diversify, because that's also in their interest. I think both the users of chips, but also the producer of chips, they can see the interest of having a bit of production in different geographical areas. But I wanted to go back on the question on research, because here I think I would like to spell out the dots. I don't think that cooperation can be detrimental to research and to innovation in the industry. So as I said in my introduction, we have leading companies, we have leading research organizations in the EU, and we don't want to kill them. We also want to push them to continue innovating, and we want them to bring their innovation to the market. So as I said, that's very important that we have this pillar 1 in the CHIPS Act, which is about developing research and innovation in Europe. But we also see very favorably that the US is also looking at how to incentivize research in the US. And what we want to do also is to have the possibility for companies and for research organizations to benefit from this a bit global ecosystem, if I can say, of research and innovation. And for example, when I mentioned the pilot lines that we want to develop in Europe, these pilot lines would not be closed. Also, what I'd like to say is that we are not choosing technologies at the EU level, and I don't think also it's what the US wants to do. We are just giving tools to develop, and then it's for the industry to come with projects of production facilities, and it's with the industry to come with a proposal to say, okay, I want to go this way, and then we see if we can facilitate the product or not. So I really think that this cooperation, that all unilateral action, but also on top of cooperation, can only help this innovation globally.
Thank you very much. Also for keeping it short, but still we have something like 5 new questions for 4 minutes. So that's going to be difficult, but a couple of highlights from the questions. One person points out there is already a body where there is international collaboration between industry associations of the US, Japan, Korea, the EU, China, and Taiwan. So could this be a helpful body, or do we need something else? Somebody else asks, what's the role of India here with its advanced IT sector, and why do we not hear more about India and semiconductors? And then lastly, there were 2 questions that deal with the question of a more holistic approach to the question of the whole ecosystem of production, where it seems to be very focused on certain aspects now and not others, for example, chemicals, and how does that play out? Now, I apologize for those whose question I have either shortened in a way that was completely off the mark, and even more for those whose questions I couldn't address anymore. But we have 5 more minutes. What I want to do is go in the reverse order and give everybody 1 minute to reflect on the new questions or on this topic to conclude. And then unfortunately, we have to leave it here. But I think the fact that there are so many questions and angles to this challenge really shows how much is at stake, how many different details need to be worked out in a sophisticated way in order to actually solve problems. And that this is probably not the last panel we will dedicate to semiconductors. So Pierre Arnaud, any last thoughts from you?
Sorry, trouble to unmute. No, I just would like to say that I hope that we came up with the proposal that can please both the users and producers of chips, because indeed, as you said, it's quite difficult. There are different opinions of what we should produce, where should the money go, and there is not a very easy reply. So I think we made choices in the EU, which is to prioritize with EU funds research, but also when it comes to production facilities, indeed to liaise with one of the last question, we also focus very much on production of chips, modern chips, but going in different technologies. So now very looking forward to what the Council and the Parliament will say. We have an honorable member here at the panel, and also very much looking forward discussion TTC also with partners, and no one is excluded. So indeed we talk more about other, but also it's to guess with another of the question, discussion will continue also with other parts of the world.
Great, thank you, Annette.
Yeah, I think I would like to come back to what I would call the thickening of the supply chain, and that needs to be done in a very inclusive way. So yes, Europe and US, but also India and other parts of the world. And ideally, we find the right balance between being on the one hand not too dependent, but on the other hand dependent enough on each other in the whole world to kind of make the progress as needed, but not polarize more than needed. And that will need a lot of wisdom, and not only from politicians, but also from all the key players involved in the industry. So I wish all of us a lot of wisdom in the coming time.
Thank you. Sarah.
I want to just answer one of the comments which asked, why can't we work within existing bodies where China is a member? I think we should be working in those bodies, but for what I'm talking about, where we're thinking about kind of a way for a group of democratically aligned, like-minded countries who play by a certain set of rules to come together, I don't think it works. I think we need to really be very strategic about who's in that group and what we want to come out of that group. And right now, from what I'm seeing, China should not qualify to be part of that group, since part of what that group should be focused on is some of the behaviors that we're seeing from China that are putting the longer term sort of competitiveness piece here at risk. The last thing I will say is that, as the EU and the US get together in the coming days and weeks, and the TTC really encourage them to be thinking about, how to take the lead on this global mapping and data assessment. And maybe that's a way to start to bring others into the fold. Thank you so much for having me. This has been excellent.
Thank you, Sarah. Last, Eva.
Thank you. Just very briefly, perhaps one last call for cooperation. I think politicians on both sides of the Atlantic, and not only, have made it clear that the production of semiconductors and securing supply chain is a political priority. Well, now it's more important to have the cooperation between the decision makers, between the industry and all others involved in that area. And by having this cooperation, I think it will be really important if we just fix all parts of the puzzle of how to produce the most advanced chips, how to make it in a swifter way, and how to make sure supply chains are not distorted. Because one thing was clear from this discussion to me is that in every single little part we need to improve, be it R&D, be it building foundries, packaging, software, finding the most prepared people, diplomatic ties, and so on. So it would take a lot of energy indeed, as Annette said, but I think there's a lot of willingness. And so if we could combine that in a good forum and in a good place, it could bear fruit, hopefully.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the panel for their participation. We could have gone on longer, but we have to end it here. Just wanted to draw your attention to next week's panel, another good one coming up, a discussion between Kate Klonick at St. John's University Law School, Jeff Hancock, who is with us at Stanford, Nate Pursley also joining the session next week. So we have a lot of interesting sessions coming up, and I hope you'll join us again. Thanks so much. Have a nice rest of your day, evening, morning, wherever you are on the globe.